Hey guys, CalebBakes01 back again with another video for you guys today, and also starting off a new series. But before we get into that, I just want to firstly apologise for the lack of content over the past, I guess what will be 2 weeks by the time this video is out. I've just been really busy, and then when I finally got time on my hands, I got a bit sick, as you can probably tell from my voice. Just a cold, so luckily not COVID. It could have been worse, but I'm alright. But this is a series that I wanted to start for a while now. If you guys are familiar with my channel, you guys know I have a top 10 series for my horror part of the channel, but I always wanted to do top 10s for music as well, so we're going to get that started today. Episode 1 being top 10 improvements between albums. I guess before we get into this list, I just want to tell you how this list is going to work and what criteria it needs to meet. So firstly, this one's going to be so obvious, you guys are going to be like, duh, that's the name of the video. But this list is purely going to be ranked on how big of an improvement between albums. And as I said, that's the most obvious thing, it's the name of the video, but I know some people are going to be like, oh, that album is so great, it's such a great album, why is it at 10? Because that's not the way it works. You know, I might have an album that is like universally loved and I know it's a great album, and I might have it low down on my list purely because the album that I'm comparing it to, you know, is also a relatively strong album, so there's not that big of an improvement between. That's how I'm going to rank this list. The albums that I'm comparing also need to be consecutive albums, so let's think of a random artist, for example, Green Day. I'm not going to compare an album like Dookie and Revolution Radio because there's a big chunk of albums between the two. They need to be consecutive albums. There are also 2 albums that I probably wouldn't put on this list anyway because they're both relatively solid. And then also, this list had a big makeover about halfway into preparing it because I originally had a different layout, but I wanted to only include albums that I'm personally really familiar with, as in, you know, I could easily just say, oh, this album's way better than that one because I haven't really listened to that one and I don't care for it, but I don't really think that's fair. So the albums both need to be albums that I'm relatively familiar with and know pretty well. But with that being said, that's all the criteria, so let's sort of get into this list now, starting off with my number 10. So coming in for number 10 on my list is Post Malone and his albums Beer Bongs and Bentleys and Hollywood's Bleeding. I feel like this is an interesting artist to open up this list because he's very different to the normal artists that I bring up on this channel, but I do like Post Malone. But beside the point, obviously the improvement album is Hollywood's Bleeding over Beer Bongs and Bentleys. I don't dislike Beer Bongs and Bentleys, I just think if you look at the track list, and for people that are familiar with this album, you're going to go to the typical singles and the well-known songs being like Rockstar and Better Now, Psycho, Candy Paint, songs like that. But Hollywood's Bleeding really has some really strong tracks in its back catalogue as well, which I think is the reason why I favour this one over Beer Bongs and Bentleys. With that being said, really strong singles as well, and songs that are really popular. You know, just off the top of my head, Sunflower. I really like Staring at the Sun, that song, sort of towards the back of the album. And Who Can Forget Take What You Want, that's such a good song as well. One of my favourite Post Malone songs at the moment. But yeah, so starting off my list for number 10, Beer Bongs and Bentleys, Hollywood's Bleeding, Post Malone. Coming in at my number 9 is Neck Deep in their albums Wishful Thinking and Life's Not Out to Get You. This being their first full-length album and this being their second. And this is a perfect example of what I was speaking about at the start of the video, being this is an album that I fucking love. And if I was ranking it on, you know, which albums I love the most, this would probably be at number 1 because this is easily in my top at least 3 albums of all time. but purely because this album is still relatively solid, I gotta put it at my number 9. The thing is, with Wishful Thinking, it's very just generic punk pop. Done very well, because as I said, I really still do like this album. But it's just very generic. This album, however, just takes it to a whole new level. If you know this album, you know exactly what I mean. There are no fucking bad songs in this album. And it really sets the standard of how I like punk pop and what I expect from really good punk pop albums that, I highly anticipate. This is really a benchmark for how I like to hear punk pop albums and what I expect, so that's where I see the improvement. It's fine, I can chuck it on and enjoy it, but this is just a fucking complete game changer. So that's why I have it at my number 9. Obviously, as I said, if we were just ranking it on how much I love the albums, this would easily be at number 1, but for improvement, Neck Deep come in at my number 9. Now, Fall Out Boy come in at my number 8 with their albums From Under the Cork Tree and Infinity on High. Once again, back to back, this is another example of like what I said with Neck Deep. If we were ranking it on how much I love albums, who the fuck doesn't like Infinity on High? It is close to, if not a perfect album. The thing is, this is also a relatively solid album. I think this is just where Fall Out Boy have perfected their craft. This is like my favourite, I guess, generation of Fall Out Boy. This was where I think they were at their peak and just making such a good standard and quality of music. But this is where they were sort of finding their sound at this time, and still a really solid album From Under the Cork Tree. But this one, just from start to finish, a lot more solid songs. I don't think anyone can argue that I think Infinity and High is the better album, but got to give props to From Under the Cork Tree as well, but definitely an improvement here, so I had to put it on my list at least, so my number 8 being Fall Out Boy, Infinity on High over From Under the Cork Tree. Flipping over to a heavier band now, being the Amity Affliction and their albums Misery and Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them. Misery is an album that I still relatively like, but they really went experimental with this one, mixing some, I guess, electronic sounds, going with an overall lighter feel, a bit more pop leaning. But this one was a real return to form, and I feel like it's really slept on. Maybe a lot of people sort of, I don't mean to be mean or put words in anyone's mouth, but maybe just jumped off board with Misery. As I said, I still don't think Misery is a terrible album, but I feel like this one's so slept on because this is a real return to form. I really hold Everyone Loves You Once you Leave Them at a really high standard, because this is such a good album. Just as I said, I think this is, for modern Amity Affliction, this is their weakest effort. But a real return to form here, so I had to include this one on the list. And definitely check this one out if you haven't. It's been out for maybe a year or two now, 2020. If you just feel like, you might be getting the same thing as what you got with Misery here, that's not the case. Just a real return to some fucking heavy, hard-hitting music, and that's why I had to include Amity Affliction's albums Misery and Everyone Loves You Once You Leave Them on my list. Now, back again with the case that we sort of had with Post Malone, featuring an artist now that you guys might not think I really listen to or would feature on this channel, but Pink and her albums I'm Not Dead and Funhouse. Now, for people who are really big fans of Pink, you might be saying, how is I'm Not Dead even considered on this list? Because I think Pink fans just universally love this album, and it is a really solid album. As I said, I just think, kind of like with what I said in some of the past ones on this list, I think the strongest songs on this one are the singles and the most well-known songs, but when you really get into the back catalogue, that's where it drops off for me. But with Funhouse, I just think it's a more all-round album from start to finish. I don't think there's really much there that is skippable, but as I said, still two really strong albums by one of my favourite female solo artists. Just, I think Funhouse is just from start to finish just really fucking solid. And yeah, as I said, nothing bad to really put down on I'm Not Dead. I think it's still a really strong album, but as I said, I just think the big improvement here is Funhouse, so that's why I have Pink on my list. Coming up to the front half of my list now with the band A Day to Remember and their albums Homesick and What Separates Me From You. Now I know I'm probably in the minority here, but I think Homesick is a relatively overrated album. Not bad, you need to know the difference between overrated and bad, because there are some really fucking amazing songs on here which are some of A Day to Remember's best. But with What Separates Me From You, it's a 10-song album, and all the songs sound different, give these different vibes. I think this is probably A Day to Remember's best album, chorus-wise, because the choruses in this album all fucking deliver something different, and they're all memorable. All the songs have personality, and I just think the improvement between these two albums is fucking amazing. As I said, I think this album is honestly a bit overrated. I think a lot of people would consider this one to be A Day to Remember at their best, but What Separates Me From You, I think, is a complete game changer. They really stepped it up, and as I said, just delivered all round, especially with the choruses. I can't sing their praises enough. The choruses on this album, as I said, they just really deliver. So my number 5 being A Day to Remember and their albums Homesick and What Separates Me From You. I was already missing before the night I left. With your love, coming in at number 4 is the Australian band, now globally known, 5 Seconds of Summer, and their album Sounds Good, Feels Good and Youngblood. Now with Sounds Good, Feels Good, this is their album where they were sort of still dabbling with trying to be a punk pop act and sort of unfortunately not pulling it off. Some of the songs came across as a bit cringy, and this album, I still like it, but just doesn't relatively hold up. They took a long break, a big hiatus, and came back with Youngblood, and I remember the first single, Want You Back, dropped, and I didn't like it at all. I was like, I fucking hate that song. Complete flip, because I really do love that song now, and I think it's one of their best on this album. And I guess with the album in general, I think it was the right decision to change their sound, take a more pop approach, really make their music come across as being more mature and I guess more suitable for the general public. Not being a bad thing, you might see that as them playing it safe, but I just think this was the right approach for them to go. For fans that love old school 5 Seconds of Summer and their punk pop attempts, this might be hard for you to hear, but I think this is the way that they're going now, because they've continued along this track, is the correct way, and I think just the improvements between these two albums is quite a big step, and credit to them for taking the risk and changing their sound, because I think it's for the better. So coming in at my number 4, 5 Seconds of Summer with their album Sounds Good, Feels Good and Youngblood. Sun will arise and we will release me from the present. I'm obsessing on these questions while I'm in denial. Now I think this could potentially be the most controversial one on this list, I'm not too sure, but 21 Pilots and their albums Vessel and Blurry Face. For people who are die-hard 21 Pilots fans and think that they don't have a bad album are going to be like, what the fuck, how do you have Vessel on here? Just for me, I think Vessel is a little bit overrated, and I'm not a huge fan of the sound that they had on this album, and I'm not saying this one completely ditched it, but if I'm being completely honest, for Vessel, there's really a handful of songs that I can go back and listen to and really, really love at any time. But for Blurry Face was a fucking complete game changer. And if you know this album well, none of the songs sound the same. They all deliver on different aspects and subgenres of music that 21 Pilots dabble with. There are no uninteresting songs on this album where I think Vessel sort of does have that. This is where 21 Pilots more so also stepped into the mainstream light and approached a mainstream audience. And, you know, I guess for old school fans, they're like, no, that's not a good thing. But I think they really pulled it off here. And I'm not saying that's what you need to do to have a good album, but I just think the improvement between these two albums was quite a big step, and they done it really well. So coming in at my number 3, as I said, probably I think this has the potential to be the most controversial one on my list, but 21 Pilots Vessel and 21 Pilots Blurry Face. Now, coming in at my number 2 is actually 2 albums that I don't own, but by a band that I actually really do like, so I need to get around to picking up their albums. They're just really hard to find. But the band Waterparks and their albums Entertainment and Fandom. Entertainment is their second, I believe, full-length album. I believe all the albums before Double Dare were EPs, but Entertainment, their second full-length album, and Fandom being their third. I just think the improvement between them was unbelievable. I think most people can agree that their first album, Double Dare, was such a fucking amazing first attempt at a full-length album. And a lot of people were anticipating Entertainment and had high expectations for it. And I feel like for the most part, even if you are a big fan of the band Waterparks, you can safely say it was a bit of a letdown. But I really do believe Fandom is the band's best effort now. I think Fandom delivers everywhere that the album Entertainment was lacking, and really delivered the goods. I wish I had the albums here to hold in my hand and, you know, safely go back and listen to all the time, especially Fandom, as I said. You know, I'm not saying there are no good songs on Entertainment. There are some songs that I can go back and revisit, but I think Fandom is just one of the best modern efforts for albums that have come out in the past. I think it's like came out 4 or 5 years ago. I think their newest album is a major step down again, so maybe I'll have to do a list on top 10 step downs between albums, but yeah, I'm getting off topic. My number 2 being Waterparks and their albums Entertainment and Fandom. And coming in at number 1 is the band Between You and Me and their albums Everything Is Temporary and Armageddon. Now, this is one I was so excited to speak about because Everything Is Temporary is an album that I like but don't love. I think it's very safe, very generic punk pop. You know, there are some highlights on this album, some good songs, but overall, as I said, I just think it's very safe and doesn't deliver too much that we haven't heard before. But Armageddon, I've said this word so many times, but a complete game changer and fucking delivers in every aspect. If you're unfamiliar with Between You and Me, they're a punk pop band. And I feel like for punk pop bands, especially in more modern times, it takes them a few albums to really polish their craft, and they end up going down this more pop-leaning route. But as I said, that normally takes a few albums. This was their first album. This is their sophomore. And if you've heard both of these, the improvement and the change of sound and how much effort they've put in to polish their craft is insane. And that's why it takes my number 1 spot, because the leap between these two, it's like out of sight. As I said, this one, it's not a bad album, but just very safe. I don't often come back to it too much. But this one, Spoiler alert, this was one of, if not my favorite album from last year. Between You and Me really fucking delivered with this one, and I couldn't recommend this album enough. You really need to check it out. I could talk about what a change between these two albums all day, because it honestly blew my mind when I heard this for the first time. As I said, it's something that normally takes punk pop bands a few years to master and perfect and work on their craft, but they pulled it off on their sophomore, so that's why I have Between You and Me at my number one. So guys, I just want to thank you for joining me on my first top 10 for my music series. This was a list that was fun to put together, and I'm excited to do a little bit more in the future. There's bands that I could have included on this list. I originally had bands like Trash Boat and Boston Manor, but as I said, I wanted to be very familiar with the albums that I included on this list. But I had fun putting it together, guys, and I hope you guys are willing to stick by and support this series. I'm actually interested to know how many of my subscribers or viewers actually come from my music content compared to my horror stuff, but against the point, I just want to thank you guys for sticking by my channel and watching a new series that I started off today, and I will hopefully see you guys very, very soon. Thanks for watching, and peace.